Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this last edition. This is not the last edition, but it's the last of this year. We arrived at number 47, and we conclude the year by talking about the Scarabeo. Well, about the Scarabeos, because one of the questions we have usually is how many Scarabeos do you have, and the second is whether this one is a Scarabeo. The Scarabeo represented a lot in the history of Alfa Romeo, but a lot of this history is not told or had consequences and impacts on other cars. It had unsuccessful, so to speak, sports stories, but it left a strong mark in history. And that's why today we invited some important guests. Well, there's one person who cannot be here in person, of course, because he's no longer with us, but he left several information in his notebooks, summaries, notes, etc., on many aspects of his life as a designer. We're talking about Giuseppe Busso, whose story we will tell next year when there will be an important anniversary. But Giuseppe Busso, in the hundreds of pages that he left to the Museum Alfa Romeo, well, he writes about the Scarabeo, describing the complexity of the project, the fact that it lasted for years, the fact that there was an alternation, and the next sentence talks about 6, 7 CEOs, managers, presidents of Alfa Romeo. So Scarabeo was born in a ward and then concluded its career in a ward which was completely different. Different was Alfa, different was the design, and also the competition universe, whereas Scarabeo could have gone on the racetrack but never participated. So let's start from the idea, a consequence of facts that led to the idea of building the Scarabeo. The Scarabeo was not born as a car per se. I mean, it was born as part of the 33 project, which was born around 1961-62, when for the first time an idea was launched in Alfa. Well, Alfa didn't have a real sports department yet because Alfa Corse was not there yet. So the idea was to have a great leap and launch a prototype car. It was not Formula One in 61-62 yet, but there was a sports championship. And despite the Formula One, the big dealers of the time, Ferrari, Matra, Porsche, Ford, etc., competed. The project was to build a 2 liters, and the team of Orazio Satta with Giuseppe Busso at the head of the project started to draw the lines of a chassis of an engine. The engine is 8 cylinders, and we know how the career it would have. It will come a little bit later. And the chassis comes from the aeronautics world. It is made by 3 big pipes with a diameter of 20 centimeters in the H shape. Well, was rapidly built, and in this picture of 14th of January 1966, we see the history of the 33 project, the project of the 33. This is the first prototype, which still have a TZ2 GTA 4-cylinder 1600 engine. But what we see here is 2 men, Salvo Sanesi, the historical test pilot of the house, Giuseppe Busso, standing next to what is a creation of his, and in the balocco hut in the back there's Carlo Chiti. So the man who was about to be in charge of the project that the car design had developed up to that point, but that would have been then finished by the Auto Delta of Carlo Chiti. Giuseppe Busso says that if the relationship between design department and Auto Delta in the end were settled and there was a good collaboration, what was never fixed was the relationship between the test pilots, so those from Alfa Romeo, and Sanesi was the most representative one. He was a pilot since the early ages of the P2, and then he had a great career. And the Auto Delta, who arrives with a new generation of test pilots, especially Teodoro Zeccoli. Anyway, it's January 1966. The project goes from one department to another, and what was the Serie A, so the Premier League of the racetrack, goes under the direction of the Carlo Chiti, who also continued the idea of producing a small limited edition series for the streets, the one which would live a very complex period but would give way to the 33 cars that would be sold. Anyway, Satta and Busso had a team that didn't like the loss of this project, and they thought that they could have space to do something in a lower segment, so not the 2 liters but the 1600s. And why not? Not between the sports but among the Gran Turismo. So from the 33 they took the most evident innovation, so the H chassis with pipes, and then they decided to use not the front part of the 33, which was kind of conventional, but that was anchored to a very complex and expensive magnesium alloy, while in the Scarabeo, a small carpentry element could be fitted, and all the suspensions, the steering wheel, etc. of the Renault R8, which was produced by the car dealer, and this would have allowed to save at least on that part of the chassis. Well, the second point of saving would have been for the back, where instead of this hollow could have been placed as 4 cylinders, which was already tested in this case of the GTA, but it could have been any 4 cylinders with 2 shafts, allowing 2 things. One, to shorten the axle, and to reduce also the driving seat. It had already been done in the past. This car, so with a seat in a very back position, the engine very strangely put and inclined, and a very low chassis, gave way to a car which was extremely small, compact, where mechanics could not exceed the line of the back wheel, so with a very low center of gravity. The project sees the light, at least on the tables of the department, but then they needed to find a dress for this car. And incredibly, for a company which was working with the Bertone, Pininfarina, Zagato, and other names, well, the choice went to Osi. Osi has a very specific history. Osi in Alfa Romeo was known for the Scarabeo and for the 2600 Deluxe. You see, the Scarabeo was only limited to 2 prototypes and a half, while the 2600 Deluxe was not many thousands of cars. So it was not a huge collaboration, but Osi was not randomly born. It was born from Ghia. Ghia, which was managed by Mario Boano, marked important moments of the design, the car design of the 50s, and then it was acquired by a prestigious and more lively company from Luigi Segre and Enrico Olivetti. Luigi Segre was a character. He was a very peculiar man who took the helm of Ghia and decided to renew it, while Enrico Olivetti was an entrepreneur and was the one who at the time owned Fergat, who produced parts for the tires and wheels, and also other companies. Well, Ghia acquired several plants before finding the final one, and the choice went to the one next to the plants of a company called Officina Stampaggi, the OS, which produced pumps, mechanical parts, and other metal elements. So at that point, Gia acquired the OS through Fergat and decides to do what almost everyone did in the 50s in the car industry. So to start with a real production line able of doing what the big car dealers, which in the 50s were starting to have the mass production with the chains, could not do. So when the Alfa Romeo produced the 1900 and the Portello, when they were born, while the Coupe and Spider versions were outsourced, Coupe to Touring and Spider to Pininfarina, especially. And the same thing happened with the Giulietta, and the same thing partly will also be valid for the Giulia. So the 50s were a period in which there was space, there was room to have a production reality to grow. Pininfarina built 5 plants in those years and had production lines working for almost all the brands. Kia started to and thought they could do the same thing through Osi, a subsidiary. So at that time, they divided the design part from the production part. So Osi launched some Osi branded cars, among them the 2600, while the design part was shifting to Borgaro. And it was in Borgaro Torinese that this picture was shot. You see Giuseppe Busso and the main players of Osi. Because Osi, well, had a design department which was very lively, and at that time, Sergio Sartorelli headed the design of the Scarabeo as well as the 126 and other Fiat, and they had also a productive capacity that could bring from a small series to a bigger series. So here the lines were born, but as always, very quickly, of the first Scarabeo, which was based on drawings signed by Sartorelli mostly, which were very cutting edge, underlining the extreme positioning to the back of all the volumes of the seats. So from here, in a short time, they arrived to the final prototype, which at least in the case of the one presented at the exhibition in Paris in 1966 is beautiful but not working. So this prototype, created by Osi with a vetro resin very light chassis, well, there were no doors, so you had to uplift the entire roof to go in, but it was a nice exercise of style based on the idea of the Scarabeo, but there was no mechanics elements in it. It was presented in Paris and received good success, even though these are the only pictures, color pictures we have in the archive, were not shot in Paris, of course, but in the design department of Borgaro, of Osi, which had a revolving element, you see, at the time, that was quite rare. After Paris, in the exhibition of Turin, the car was presented again, and Giuseppe Busso meets Giuseppe Luraghi, and Giuseppe Luraghi was struck by that car and wanted to produce a small Gran Turismo, much more innovative than the TZ2 that just completed their career, but not expensive, at least from certain points of view. So charges Giuseppe Busso to go on with the project and to add the mechanic parts to the Scarabeo. And he also authorizes him to anticipate the Scarabeo on the house organ of Alfa Romeo, the Quadrifoglio. So that was the starting point of that car. At this point, the works start. It's at the end of 1966, and it is a moment when on one side the design abandoned the 33, and on the other side it started to bring the first to take the first steps with the Auto Delta. So Busso's work was always in danger, because from one month to another the project could go to Auto Delta, even though the car design department thought that they could have a space to produce, design, and also sell on the market the Scarabeo. So in the archive, in our documentation office, which is the source of all the information we have today on the car, there are several folders dedicated to the Scarabeo. Some are official, others are non-official. They are written with the pencil. So anyway, what starts to come out is the outline of the car, which revolves around the powertrain scheme. So the 4 cylinders with 2 shafts is mounted like this, together with the normal gear of a Giulia, so a linear gear. But at the tip of the gear, there is a part produced by ZDF and another part connected to a differential element linked to the brakes and the friction. It is a system that allows Alfa Romeo to save a lot because the engine has no modification compared to the usual assembly on the Giulia. The gear does not have to be redesigned. You just have to create 2 elements with magnesium alloy and you're done. So as you can see from this drawing, instead, a modification which was very strong, and Giuseppe Busso says it was Mr. Loragis who won this, is to replace the front suspensions which derive from the R8 with the one of the 33. So even though, by simplifying a little bit, that magnesium alloy supported it. So we have the first drawings and then the calculations that are directly referring, as you see in the top line, to the designs of the 105 33. So the front part becomes more sophisticated and expensive, but produced in-house. In this case, we see a page with all the weights of the components, what both those done in series and the custom ones, for a total of 670 kilograms, which made it a car which weighed like the TZ2, but with a more sophisticated assembly and balancing, with all the masses concentrated and with a back driving seat. In this case, with the 10511, which is the TZ and the 33 2 liters, the weights, the sizes, etc. are compared, as well as the performances, explaining that the maximum speed could vary from the configuration, but that in the case of the Scarabeo, it tended to suffer more compared to the Le Mans type cars, while it could be more competitive with the short tail versions developed for Nürburgring, for example. So from there, through this series of calculations that are contained in like 4 folders, which are very informal, as I said, they built the first running prototype. This first running prototype has no chassis initially, and Busto says that Mr. Bianco from Osi very rapidly put together at least the part of the chassis, the front part, and another part which looks as the side but without the doors, without anything. So with some plexiglass riveted to this virtual racing chassis, he created a very enveloping windshield, and the rest is left without coverings. So you could see the engine, you could see the shaft, the inclination of the elements, the back suspensions, and the exhaust. So this is the picture which was done at the time of this first prototype. And after that, as I said, it had just half a chassis. So once the development was finished, we arrived in winter 1968, when it was brought to Balocco, and no longer with Salvo Sanesi, because in the meantime the design team had to give this product to Autodelta, but Teodoro Zecoli starts to try the Scarabeo. So, several tests are done, but in 1968, the Alfa Romeo brought numerous modifications to the 33 2-liters, giving way to the Daytona series with the back radiators, and was going to win the Daytona competition in 1968 and then to win other titles. So, in short, the Autodelta worked more and more. They aimed at the best and the top, so the 3 liters engine started to be produced, etc. And they didn't have time to test the Scarabeo. So, this prototype, anyway, had a series of tests somehow, and the idea starts to surface to get back to the original project. So a car that could not only be a competition car, but could also have a market on the street cars. So Ozzy was asked to adapt a chassis of a sedan to this prototype. So Ozzy didn't adapt that sophisticated dress that was presented in Paris, but very rapidly built a very functional car, which is the car which is still here at the museum. So in this case, the proportions are the same of the Paris prototype. The front part is somehow simplified and streamlined, but this chassis rapidly made allows to Alfa Romeo, while Autodelta was in charge of the project at the time, to continue the tests. And then we are in 1969, and clearly time has passed. The 33 is absorbing all the time of Autodelta, and so they decided to abandon the project. Busso fears that this is the first step of a bigger danger, which is seeing another series of projects of small sedan with a central engine, but based on the boxer of the Alfa Sud, which was perfect if you brought from the back to the front the mechanical groups. And Gruppo, in one of his notes, writes that he was startled that this would never happen in the end. And also the small coupe made with the powertrain of the Alfa Sud would use the chassis of the Alfa Sud. That was the Alfa Sud Sprint. But so what happens of the 3 prototypes built? So the one that you see, which since the beginning is given to the museum. Sometimes it is exhibited, some other times it is not, but it's not restored or used, and its conditions are the one that you see, and then you can also see it from up close and open. The second running car, which was actually the first, I mean the Spider, it goes to the second-hand dealer of Alfa Romeo, so the department of Alfa Romeo, where all the scraps were sent, but someone saw that it was there, but it was not crashed. It would stay there for long years, and then in conditions that unfortunately, show the years of neglection, would finish in the Alfa Romeo collection. So, and now we want to restore it and expose it next to its twin. While the other one, which is missing, and these are the 2 pages of Dipre, which is Direzione Progettazione Esperienze, stating the characteristics, the numbers, 2 and 1 of the Spiders, of the 2 cars that remain in-house. The non-running prototype, so the one which aesthetically was very well taken care of and was produced in Paris, was sold by Ozzy to an American owner. And this means that the new owner wants to use it. Since that car was not running and it didn't have the heart of the Scarabeo, so both the engine of the GTA, but that could be found somewhere. But especially there were parts of the transmission, like other parts. Well, the new owner takes the chassis, takes good part of it, and builds an American origin mechanical element. So adapting the chassis, the suspensions, etc. The car, Busso says, is changed a lot, but it remained a working car for many years in the US. And finally, I'm almost sure that the car is being restored, not with the American engine, but with specifications of the Scarabeo, and over the next years, maybe we will have the opportunity to see it again. So that car is not lost, but it was sold several times, and finally someone decided to restore it to its origins. Also, thanks to the collaboration of the documentation center, it was possible to retrieve some missing data. At this point, looks like the history of Alfa Romeo, well, it's 1969, as I said, is finished here on one side. Alfa Sud takes care of the small cars. On the other side, the 33 is growing, while Carlo Kitty is looking ahead and starting to see the Formula One, which was the main series. And that's where the Auto Delta wanted to arrive. But once again, the project is not forgotten totally of the small compact car. In the meantime, new possibilities were given by the growth in terms of image and in terms of competitiveness of the what would become the rallies, and partly due to this and partly because in the auto design department someone kept talking about the Scarabeo. Orazio Satta at a certain point in January 1970 goes to Luraghi and asks to take the project by using some innovations that were being developed for the Alfetta, which in those years was living a difficult moment because it was difficult to create all the elements like the Transact structure. So, if you know the codes of the Alfa Romeo models, you would immediately recognize that from the 105 of the Scarabeo, you go from to 116. 116 is what determines all the Alfetta series, because Orazio Satta, before starting the project, said that he wanted to advertise, also to divert the attention of the company to the problems of the Alfetta. Well, he wanted to use the De Dion bridge and the new chassis designed for the Alfetta. At this point, there was still a question mark. Ozzy was shut down. They didn't want to create from scratch a chassis. They didn't want to create a concept chassis. So Giuseppe Busso was thinking about what was available that could easily be adapted to the peculiarity of the Scarabeo. So if we think at the time with the Alfetta GT that still had to come, the Giulia GT from Bertone, which was very low in the back part, well, the Zagato design for the Junior Z came up, and the characteristic was a very high back, which could have covered the engine, which was inclined. So again, Alfa Romeo, and not yet Auto Delta, takes the front part of the platform of the Alfetta. They make some modifications. They take the De Dion bridge, very similar to the Alfetta one, which due to its configuration would have left room at the center for a transmission like the one of the Scarabeo, and would be united to the Junior Z chassis. And this, according to Busso, would have developed a prototype which was not too catchy like the Alfetta, even though these efforts would soon vanish due to the fact that on this prototype the big element of the roof would be placed and then made immediately recognizable the Scarabeo from a normal Junior Zagato. In this case, we see that most of the work is done not on the transmission, but on the suspensions, in which the Dion bridge is adapted, while the gear, the supported differential, the tilted differential shaft were the same, designed in 1966 for the original Scarabeo. So again, everything is prepared. Well, a modification that was not necessary in 1966, but was then needed for the triangle of the Dion bridge, was necessary in the Scarabeo 2, was the redesign of the oil sump. As you see, it has a very specific triangular shape. In this case, also the engine was no longer the GTA one, which was considered old and obsolete. The project started in the beginning of 1970, and the complete car arrived at the end of 1972, but it would be the one of the 2000 GT Veloce, so two valves, etc. So at this point, again, the project is given to Autodelta, so all the drawings are given, the prototypes are given to Autodelta, and Autodelta starts the development of the car in Balocco. In Alfa Romeo, the technical drawings are recorded, which are then mounted here on the microfiche that were kept in the Archiva Varese. That's why we have all the series almost of the post-war period. And these are, well, the scanning, well, the microfilm drawings zoomed. So you see the Dion bridge, similar to the Alfetta one, and in this case the same component from a different side. But what continues to be written on loose sheets of paper in these transition times between Alfa Romeo and Autodelta is a series of calculations on the weights. So the weight of the chassis were higher than the original Scarabeo because the 33 was 55 kilos, while a chassis which was mostly derived from the Alfetta and the part from the Junior Zagato welded together was 264 kilograms, a lot more. And then there were all the calculations of how the other elements would have impacted to the real weight. So liquids, pilots, fuel, and I started to simulate all the different conditions of load in which the car would go on the market or on the racetrack. In this case, these calculations are signed by Bruno Zavel, which several times participated to our backstages. But if we continue, well, these data are compared to the data that had to be the competitors of the time, at least for the Alfa Romeo of the time, both internal and external. So there's the Spider Duetto, Junior Zagato, with which it shares some element, but also the Alpine 1914, Lotus Europa, which was a big stimuli for the Alfetta development, because for the first time they presented a very light car with a central engine, then Fiat X19 and Marcus, but that's another chapter, with a wooden chassis and many other specific characteristics. In any case, having done all the calculations, this was given to the Autodelta, which takes the drawings. Well, these are drawings from the Auto Design, which are rebranded and re-stamped Autodelta when the copy is given to the Settimo race department. And again, in this case, the test phase starts. Of course, the Scarabeo 2 was an alternative, but if the Scarabeo was, in a certain sense, killed by the attention given to the 33, the Scarabeo 2 was 1974, when there was the World Championship, the return to the World Championship, and at the eve of Brabham relationship was an unlucky period, and then we had the alternated license plates, the oil crisis, the obsession with consumption, etc. So, what was born to be a GT, not a sports car, so a two-seater vehicle to be sold on the market, well, the attention declined, and the project was then in 75 abandoned, even though in one of the tests done in Balocco, a picture was leaked. So on Corriere della Sera, Mr. Morosini wrote a column, and after a month, you see, well, the news was then not confirmed by the company, but after 1 month, there was the picture, and they said, so it is true what we said, the Alfa Romeo is working on a car like this with a central engine. When this news was published, actually, it was 2 weeks before the death of Satta, just before Luraghi left the company, so the project was coming to an end. And in reality, another thing that was not known was whether this was a fake picture that Carlo Chitti used to give out to the journalists to tease, or whether it was a real stolen picture. So in any case, this is the last real picture of the Scarabeo 2. After that, the risk was that also this car would go to the second-hand scrap dealer of Varese. But then there was another phase. Well, in 1972, there were other designs, and these went on parallel with the Scarabeo 2. And this had to do with the Bankel engine, which at the time was developed. We had a backstage with Giorgio Figliozzi dedicated to this, but well, this in 1972, even the Bankel engine was at the end of its career. So, in our archive, we have no trace of a car that ever used the Bankel engine. We have sort of 40 sheets of calculations, no technical drawing, which was developed up to a level of a real development. But in any case, on a note handwritten by Giuseppe Busso, we see how the Bankel engine and the attention that it raised at the end of the 60s was one of the incentives to restart the project of the Scarabeo, which was revolving around the idea of a very compact engine, and even more compact it would have been if instead of the 4 cylinders, they would have put just a 2 shafts engine. But what happened with this prototype? Well, it was put in a warehouse where, ironically, almost no one knew that it was there or what that was. Until Bruno Bonini went to that warehouse, he spotted the car, noticed the central engine, he started to do researches, and then he asked Giuseppe Busso, and Busso told him what that was. Well, it was one of the Magnificent Seven. Even his father, Pietro Bonini, was one of the many right hands of Bruno Gobbato, the famous one of the Speer letter. But Bruno Bonini was not only one of the Magnificent Seven, but was also one of the creators of the collection of the museum. For many years, he was the only one authorized to drive the cars of the museum, and who still was going around the warehouses, which were abandoned, finding objects and still cars at the time that could be interesting for the museum. So Bruno Bonini took the car, which was not in these conditions, and then later on decided to repaint it, to restore it, and to complete the finishings and to place it in the collection of the museum in the conditions that you see now. And at the point, it's 1975. Well, actually, it's in 1984, for the Scarabeo, the story really came to an end. It's a very long history, longer than what the presence of these prototypes could make you think. And Giuseppe Buzzo, at the end of his memoirs that he sends to Giovanni Cancellieri, who publishes it on Ruote Classiche, in a shortened version, but Giuseppe Busso, when he sends it to Giovanni Cancellieri, says, I apologize for this talk, but my Scarabeos deserve this talk, long talk, right? Because many people worked on that project, and many things could have happened, but didn't happen, just for a little bit. So I conclude this backstage. We are thinking about an agenda for next year. Next year is 2023, so there's many anniversary, the Auto Delta, the Alpha 33, the DTM victory in 1993, and there's many other topics that have no anniversary but deserve a space in backstage. So I would like to thank people who are at the backstage, people who work during these 47 conferences, even though they are not here on the stage. So Raffaella Quacquaro, my colleague working with the press and responsible for the communication of the museum, who works with the same passion at the backstage, Gemma Perrone and Alberto Steitz, who work in the documentation center, Marco Torregiani, Roberto Cavaliere, who deal with the maintenance of the museum, and if the cars are nice, and because they are here, it's thanks to them, and in general to all the staff of the museum, even though the acknowledgements go to our audience that both here live and during the streaming lives that we have both in Italian and in English always followed and supported us, and is also pushing, suggesting the new themes. Thanks everyone, and have a nice rest of your day. I wanted to ask you, what's the origin of the Scarabeo name? Well, in general, there's two elements. One is the historical period in which it was very trendy to have names recalling the shape of the car. So in the same years that Carabo was born, which was another insect, and the first prototype was defined by Giuseppe Busso, like a lizard who lost its tail, with a truncated back and unbalanced towards the front part. But in the press release, which was presented by Ozzy at the Paris exhibition 66, the origin of the name is not explained. So, of course, you just have to imagine it for the compact car. And in the Carabo, for example, there is an explanation on the press release explaining that not only the car originated the name, but that the name provoked some chromatic choices, especially the windows, which were a little bit gilded, even though they are not transparent as before. That's it. Then have a nice rest of your day.